It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Tom Ginsburg, who is the Leo Spitz Professor of International Law and a Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago Law School. He holds BA, JD, and a PhD degree from the University of California at Berkeley. Before becoming a teacher of law, Dr. Ginsburg served as a legal advisor at the Iran U.S. Claims Tribunal at The Hague. He continues to work with international development agencies and foreign governments on legal and constitutional reform. Dr. Ginsburg currently directs the Comparative Constitutions Project, an effort funded by the National Science Foundation to gather and analyze the constitutions of all independent nation-states since 1789. Dr. Ginsburg is the author of a number of books, including Judicial Review in Democracies in 2003 and The Endurance of National Constitutions in 2009. Both won Best Book designations from the American Political Science Association. He also wrote Judicial Reputation, a Comparative Theory, and The Endurance of National Constitutions. His newest book, which he co-authored, is How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, which comes out next month and is the subject of today's talk. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Tom Ginsburg.
Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I also want to thank Nancy for inviting me out here. It's a great pleasure. I'm from California, so I teach at the University of Chicago, so I don't make it this far north, but it's really cool. I got to come out much more often. It's also a very exciting day for me because scholars like me, we write these books and they take forever to come out, and I just got the very first copies of this yesterday, so I'm really excited. I have a couple here. And I also have some cards if any of you are interested for ordering the book. But the book is co-authored with my colleague Aziz Huq, who also teaches at the University of Chicago. And what we're trying to do is to look at the pressures on democracies all over the world and think about the implications for the United States. Too often we think sort of in the mindset of American exceptionalism that things that happen elsewhere could never happen here, but indeed they can, and sometimes they do. 1 second. Yeah. And sometimes they do. And so what we want to do is sort of think about the processes which are pressuring democracies around the world, and then ask the question about whether the Constitution of the United States is capable of standing up to those things. And one of our arguments is, in fact, that in some ways the American Constitution actually can facilitate the erosion of democracy. But first, let me start with some data. Political scientists who look around the world say that the number of democracies around the world peaked around 2006. And every year since then, there have been fewer democracies. In the heart of Europe, we have these kind of what are called illiberal democracies by their leaders. In Poland and Hungary, populist governments of sort of right, left. It's hard to categorize them, but populism being a kind of a force for illiberalism, certainly. We have democracies that, in some cases, stood for several decades that have now collapsed, as in Venezuela, the more complicated case of Turkey. And we see the rise of what political scientists call anti-system parties, parties that run against the system without sort of traditional policies and programs, simply trying to dismantle without a positive agenda. We see those spreading throughout the rich industrial democracies of the world. We also have a number of cases, and we're very interested in these, close calls, democracies which seemed to be about to die, and then they were sort of saved from the brink, and so we want to pay special attention to that. What are the forces that prevent democracies from dying if they're at risk? Now this figure here is shows sort of the percentage of governments in the world that fall into 3 categories. And you can see the top line there is the number of democracies, the solid line. And since, let's see if this pointer works, yeah. So since about 1975, that number has risen in what political scientists call the third wave of democracy, third wave of global spread of democracy. And ever since that time, it's been the sort of single biggest category. But as you can see, the wave peaks around 2006. We have these other categories, true autocracies, now on the rise again, and what are called hybrid regimes. which seems to be a kind of regime which might look democratic on the outside. They might have elections and courts and constitutions, but in fact are really dominated by one party and there's no real competition. And that's a very sophisticated type of regime which is spreading around the world. This one indicator suggests that the democratic wave has crested. Another way to look at it is to look at the quality of democracy in any given country. So not just the number yes or no, but the level of democracy. And we have various measures which try to do that. This is the Freedom House in Washington, D.C., and this charts from 2006 the number of countries in which democracy has declined in red and improved in blue. And you can see that sort of the quality of democracy seems to be declining as well. Yet a third measure is that of The Economist magazine, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and they divide countries into 4 different kinds. Full democracies, flawed democracies where there's some problem, hybrid regimes, as I described before, and then true authoritarian regimes. And what's interesting, as of 2017, is that the number of countries in the top 2 categories is now smaller than the number in the bottom 2. The number of people living in the countries in the top 2 categories is now smaller. So now most of the world's people do not live in democracy. That was not true just a few years ago. Most importantly for us, The Economist actually downgraded the United States from being a full democracy to what they call a flawed democracy. And there's lots of reasons why. It's kind of an index that they aggregate a bunch of different data, but we're just at the very top, along with Japan, by the way, at the very top of the flawed democracy list. And the main factor seems to be the way we run elections, which I'll return to periodically throughout the talk. It's a mess. There's a wonderful new organization of political scientists that's called Bright Line Watch. And I guess it takes the name from the idea that, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but the way democracies die nowadays is different than it used to, than the way democracies used to die. That is, in our conception of the end of democracy, we tend to think about like a communist revolution or a military coup or some sudden end, a collapse. And it turns out, when you look around the world, the far more common risk for democracies today is not the sudden collapse, but the slow erosion. The sort of boiling frog syndrome, where there's institutional sort of decay along a lot of dimensions. And eventually, if you add that up, you're no longer really a competitive democracy. And so we are really focused on that in this book. It's all about that erosion is the risk around the world generally. It's especially a risk if we want to talk about the United States. There's not going to be a collapse of democracy in the United States. I do sometimes get emails from members of the public saying, aren't we about to have a coup or something like that? No, we're not going to have a coup. We're not going to have a revolution. We are at great risk of erosion because of the sort of crises in many of our institutions. What the Bright Line Watch does is sort of taking up this kind of theme. It identifies a bunch of different dimensions and measures democracy along them. And I guess the name comes from the idea that it is sometimes hard to know exactly what is the moment at which a democracy has so eroded as to no longer be worthy of the label. The death by 1,000 cuts, well, what's the one which actually leads to the death and such. And so Bright Line Watch is the idea that we should be identifying bright lines, and that democracy ultimately in any country depends on the ability of the public to mobilize around bright lines, around clear signs that democracy is at risk. So this figure shows in their rating system the rating of the American democracy, and you can see that early in our history, certainly by my definition, we wouldn't call us a democracy. There was not the franchise was quite restricted. In my view, we only really become a democracy in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, because I define democracy as when a modal adult can vote. And so if you don't empower women, you're not really a democracy. But others might even say that it's not really until the 1964 Civil Rights Act that we really have become a democracy. So you can have different definitions, of course. But you can see the picture is pretty clear. You see a sudden decline here on these measures, and especially in the last 2 years. What they do, and this slide is a little hard to read, but basically what they do is they take 20 dimensions on which we might evaluate American democracy. Things like, are elections conducted in a fraud-free manner? Is there free speech? Are districts biased? Are investigations conducted without interference and such? And they do two things. First, they survey both experts and the public, and they ask people two questions. Is this feature important for democracy? And then how well does the US do? And it's interesting, a lot of the dimensions people think are very important for democracy, but they differ in terms of their assessment as to how well we're actually doing. So this is two different expert surveys. And basically the way to read it is they've conducted, when they first did the survey, which is right after the Trump election, that's sort of these sort of light blue dots, and then the later surveys in the triangles. And so it shows you whether experts think it's been getting worse or better. And you can see that, on some dimensions, experts think we do pretty well. Vote counting, lack of electoral fraud generally is pretty good in this country. The parties are generally allowed to compete. On other dimensions, though, very few experts would say that we do well. The drawing of the boundaries of electoral districts is basically a partisan affair. And common understanding of facts is a dimension they talk about. That seems to be something, as well as just participation. You might just measure democracy by how many people, what percentage of the population is actually engaged and showing up and voting. And we don't do very well on that. They also asked the public these things. And this figure shows the public assessments of the same questions. And they're different. They have different things that they think we do well or poorly on. I mean, one thing to note is if you take the 50% mark, on most of these things, most of the public thinks we do not do well. So it's not just a professor saying that American democracy is in trouble. The American public doesn't think we're performing well. The red and the blue indicate Trump vote approvers and non-approvers, and you can see there is a gap. So the Trump voters tend to think, well, we're not doing so bad. We have equal voting rights. That's a big gap up on top, equal voting rights between the Trump voters and the non-Trump voters. One of the interesting things about this is if you look at it over time, the numbers are diverging. So the Trump supporters think democracy is actually improving over the last couple of years. Trump opponents do not think it's getting much worse. And so we're polarizing on this dimension as well. Now, as I said before, democracies can die in two ways. And those of us who work on constitutions around the world tend to focus on the collapse. And our thinking was really informed in this field by writing that was done after the end of World War II, the reconstruction of Germany and Japan and Italy as constitutional democracies, and certain tools that go by the name of militant democracy. That's our label for them, that recognize that sometimes undemocratic parties can rise up and take over the system. And so this allowed, for example, the post-war German Constitutional Court to ban the Communist Party in West Germany, to ban the Nazi Party, the Reformed Nazi Party in Germany, to say, well, certain parties just aren't allowed to compete. Also, certain kinds of speech is not allowed. So, a common category is hate speech regulation, which we do allow in our country. We don't restrict at all, but in many other countries you do have regulations on that, on the theory that we have to kind of structure the rules of the democratic game. Now, our view is that these tools might be, in fact, dangerous in some ways. We're not really in favor of those. But the bigger point is that we think that we ought to be thinking as constitutional designers, if you will, about the risk of erosion and thinking about what kinds of institution can prevent democracies from being eroded slowly. This figure shows, on the left, 3 different political science indicators of democracy. And what we do is we count up the number of quick collapses versus slow erosions over time. And what we show is that erosion has always been a risk. It's always been a major threat. Democracies do tend to die slowly, but we haven't really thought about how to design institutions to prevent that from happening. Now, I want to say one thing before I go any further. Just be clear about my definition, because democracy, like any other complex concept, has a lot of different definitions. People tend to put in there things that they like. And we have a very kind of minimalist view. You have to have elections, as I said, in which the modal adult can vote, and in which the losers give up power, right, if they were holding power. Now, that's a very simple political science definition. We, sort of being constitutional lawyers, also recognize that that's kind of legally constructed. There's certain legal institutions which make the election's actually effective. And in particular, we emphasize rights to freedom of speech and freedom of association, freedom to run for office and such. But that's about it. We don't have a lot of rights in our definition of democracy. I mean, you can find some people say, well, it's not really democracy unless there's a right to health care or something like that. You can put all kinds of things in there. We have a really sort of minimalist definition. But we do add one thing which is not in most conventional definitions, which we call the rule of law in administration. And most obviously, that means whoever's counting the votes has to be following the rules in an objective way. You have to have bureaucrats who are actually counting the votes, which is not to be taken for granted by any means in many countries. More importantly, I think that there's something really important about the idea of a sort of neutral civil service, neutral bureaucracy, which just implements the instructions that are put down in law, that follows the law. And the reason I think that is so important is because if the administrative structure of a government, which every government needs, whatever its program, if the administrative structure of government becomes a tool of partisan, becomes vulnerable to partisan purges and packing and things like that, well then, if you think about it, the stakes of controlling government become extremely high. And no one's ever going to want to give up power if you know that your successor can fire, in the United States, 2 million federal employees and put their own supporters in. It's necessary for democracy to have a kind of objectively, well, at least formally neutral bureaucracy that follows the instructions according to law. So we think that's really critical. But other than that, our definition is really thin. You could have a social welfare state, you could have a neoliberal, libertarian kind of scheme, economic policy and such. Even minority protection isn't really built into our definition. It's very thin. And that's something we might debate. But we wanted a thin definition because we want to get to the core of it in order to figure out how it's sustained and not conflate the concept with other ones. All right, now if you look around the world at these eroding democracies, places like Turkey and Hungary and Poland and Venezuela, one of the interesting things is that the tools to erode democracy, the steps that are taken, are often legal in character. They're often using the law to undermine democracy. And indeed, one of the ways of thinking about our project is to ask, suppose you had a leader in the United States who wanted to erode democracy and the person was a lawyer, like Vladimir Putin is a lawyer, or Viktor Orban in Hungary is a lawyer, or the Polish fellow Kaczynski who runs their party. They're all lawyers. And they're very systematic and very careful about the steps they are taking, one step at a time, each one of which does not seem to add up to much, each one of which seems legal and marginal. And yet they have, in each of those three countries, served to consolidate power in the hands of a single, sort of charismatic individual. And so that is the law can be used, and the law is, in fact, in our era, likely to be used to erode democracy, and therefore lawyers and constitutionalists have to come up with a response. We identify sort of 5 categories of legal tools. So first of all, a very common thing one observes is constitutional amendments to entrench the person in power, the incumbent in power. And perhaps the paradigm thing to think about here is term limits. In any given year, there's a number of presidents around the world who come up to the end of their constitutionally dictated term when they took office. It's very tempting to try to stick around. And we see all kinds of strategies, using the courts or amending the Constitution, but the basic idea is to entrench yourself through constitutional reform. Another technique is to bypass the kind of checks and balances which sort of most constitutional democracies have. Most constitutional democracies have some idea of the separation of powers. And yet those things can be bypassed or controlled. So a good example here is when Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela miraculously lost an election to the National Assembly last year. He said, that's fine. By the way, we're going to suspend the National Assembly, and he had the Supreme Court say that all of its actions were null and void. And then he created something called a Constituent Assembly so that the people could directly govern. And of course, the people in that assembly were people he picked and such. And this is, by the way, a theme in terms of a lot of the populism that's going on now. There's kind of this charismatic leader who purports to speak for the people directly. And if you think about it, since only that leader, the leader's claim is, I know what the people want. The people are univocal. It's a single entity. And the leader channels the voice. And of course, if that's your setup, you're not going to want any intermediate institutions. Any intermediate institution is kind of a threat to a leader's claim to speak directly for this sort of magical entity called the people. And so one of the themes we see is a lot of appeals to constituent assemblies and new constitutions and such, because that's the ultimate, in democratic theory, kind of the ultimate place the people have their say. So we do see this kind of bypassing of elected institutions. Packing the courts, if there's been one major trend in my adult lifetime in governance around the world, it's been what we call judicialization. So not just in the United States, but in lots of countries. You see courts making major important decisions about who will be in office and how the rules of the game will function. And of course, it's sort of an iron law of politics that if an institution becomes powerful, it becomes a target for those who want to exercise political power. And so we see attempts to take over the courts, most recently in Poland this year, Hungary the last couple of years, where they've essentially fired the Supreme Court's and Constitutional Court's memberships, declared their prior jurisprudence void, and then filled with new supporters. And so the courts become a tool. The rule of law institutions I was referring to are obviously subject to the same kind of efforts. You kind of purge the predecessor's supporters and fill it with your own, and then you've got something that looks neutral on its face, but in fact is not. Electoral competition, well, this is the core of the matter, and we see a lot of techniques, of course, to interfere with actual electoral competition. And I have to say, this is, again, one of these things which our country is, we're full of this kind of stuff. So disenfranchisement of your opponent's geographic areas, that happens all over the world. Drawing the boundaries so that, as we sometimes say, that the voters don't pick the politicians pick their voters, which I think is a safe description of the United States in many, many, many states. And interestingly, removing powers of offices you do lose. So I mentioned the National Assembly in Venezuela. Earlier, Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, had lost the mayorship of Caracas, the capital city. And so what he did before he could take power, before the mayor could come into power, he said, that's fine. By the way, we're going to create a new capital district, which is going to do all the things that the city government used to do, and that person will be appointed by the President of the Republic. So that, yeah, they lost an election, but removed the powers of the office before the person came in. Those of you who follow these things will have noted that early 2017, the North Carolina Republicans tried to do the same thing. The courts told them they couldn't, but again, there's no reason to think that these strategies only exist in far-flung places. Michigan, yes, and Ohio has its own version of it, Wisconsin, so. In terms of speech and association, this is obviously a core thing. If rights to speech and association are critical for democracy to function, for elections to be effective, well, we see a lot of tactics to kind of squeeze the public sphere. The aggressive use of libel law by government against critics, so that a newspaper that says something, reports honestly about something that the government did will be charged and subjected to a big damage award. Lots of it moves in countries not as robust and rich as the United States to manipulate the media. So even in Mexico, it turns out that government advertising is a big component of the advertising budget, the revenue for a lot of media companies, and so the government can manipulate that and say, well, if you report unfavorably, we're going to stop advertising with you. Even a country as big and robust as Mexico. So you can imagine in a smaller country, smaller media market, government has a lot of power over these companies through advertising, as well as through the regulatory stuff like tax audits and things like this. Last year was the worst year for journalists in history. More journalists killed, since we've been keeping track, and more arrested. So that is obviously a grave threat to a kind of a robust public sphere. Civil society activists say the same thing is happening to civil society organizations. And again, the tools are often legal. tax audits, registration requirements, harassment of your activists, wanting to report your lists and funding sources and such. And so this means it's very hard to organize, obviously. The use of anti-conspiracy law, anti-terrorism law, or abuse of those laws is sort of ripe. And actually, being at a university, I focus on the, how universities do play a really critical role in just the idea that knowledge is a pursuit, and we may never be able to definitively, get at the final truth, whatever that is. But we're all engaged in the enterprise, and we have common standards for saying, well, some things are false, right? And some things are closer to the truth or provisionally true for now. We've seen a lot of attacks on universities in a place like Turkey. They fired all the deans of after the coup last year, Erdogan took the opportunity to fire every dean of every university in Turkey and force them to reapply for their jobs back on kind of a condition of loyalty. In Hungary, there have been attacks on the Central European University, and because of its association with George Soros, and more broadly, I think this idea that there are no facts, it's all just where you sit, is obviously dangerous because you can't really have a democracy. The idea of democracy is that we accept the facts and we disagree about policy, not that the facts themselves are partisan in any sense. All right, so that's very depressing, I'm sure. Now, surely that couldn't affect us here in the United States. How does the United States Constitution stack up on these things? Well, this figure is from my Comparative Constitutions Project, and what we do is this index here is like a level of similarity, formal similarity to the American Constitution. And what the dots are, they represent all the constitutions adopted since 1789 in Latin America and then for all countries. And what you see, the sort of gist of the figure is that you see kind of a shift away from the US model, right? That over time, countries have been moving away from the US, and that's been interpreted by some scholars being, oh, it's a loss of American influence. But the way I see it is that law is kind of like a technology. Constitutions are kind of a technology of governance. And what we're observing, in fact, is that other countries, by virtue of not having constitutions that last very long, are able to renew and update their institutions, experiment with different things, and over time, sort of collectively, we come up with different models, different institutions, different ways of running things. In another book of mine, I've showed that the Endurance of National Constitutions book, we show that the predicted lifespan for a national constitution for all countries is only 19 years. So most citizens of the world are kind of going through a lot of constitutions. That's probably too much turnover. But we would, it might be the case that 229 is a little bit old. So what are the things that some of these other constitutions have? What are the holes in the American Constitution? Why do I claim that it actually might facilitate democratic erosion? Well, first of all, modern constitutions all recognize that sometimes you have emergencies. There's a war or a natural disaster, and that means, or a financial crisis, and that means you have to exercise powers that you might not have thought about in advance. In a way, that's the definition of an emergency. The existing institutions can't handle it. You don't really know what you're going to need. So, since the time of the Romans, the idea is, well, we're going to allow exceptional exercises of powers for a limited period, subject to some kind of legal authorization. And that's what anyone writing a constitution today would do. We don't have that we don't talk about emergencies scarcely at all in the American Constitution. How about the institutional checks? Well, when Madison was doing his work, he was thinking, it was an era before there was political parties, and so that he had the idea that the separation of powers would be, as one person has said, a kind of a machine that would run itself, that ambition would counteract ambition, and you'd have a kind of natural equilibrium that would develop where no institution would ever become very powerful. Now that sounds great in theory, but what we have observed in American history is that when one party controls all the branches, well, those checks and balances don't really operate. And it's an interesting time to think about this, but some people would say that the Congress today is not really acting as Congress qua Congress vis-a-vis the president, and that should be a source of concern. So Madison's assumptions maybe didn't play out. In terms of the rule of law institutions, a new constitution adopted today would likely have a whole set of institutions, we sometimes call this the fourth branch of government, institutions just focused on accountability, like a counter-corruption commission where you have to give your declare your assets when you go into office and then declare them when you leave, and we can see if there's a discrepancy. Or monitor government malfeasance or bad behavior, an ombudsman or something. So we don't have anything like that. We rely a lot on the federal courts, and on some matters they do a good job. On, for example, the issues that we were discussing with regard to North Carolina and the kind of blatant attempts to sort of rig democracy. But in other areas, and again, electoral law provides many examples, the courts just stay away from it. One of my colleagues at the University of Chicago had a case in front of the Supreme Court last year about partisan gerrymandering. And, and the Supreme Court has always wanted to stay away from that because they think that there's not really a standard that they can use to sort of police gerrymanders that are in and gerrymanders that are out. And that's, of course, left the field wide open, which actually gets to my next one, partisan electoral administration. The Constitution, of course, allocates the management of elections to state legislatures. It's locked in there. And so, again, Madison might not have realized that these were going to be partisan bodies, and that's essentially letting the proverbial fox guard the hen house. But that's what we've ended up with. There are, I should say, 14 states where the voters, through the initiative process, have amended the Constitution to create a nonpartisan electoral commission to draw the boundaries and manage elections. And we do know, political scientists who look at this know that the elections in those states are more competitive, more responsive to changes in popular opinion and such. So it really does matter if you can somehow get to more neutral administration. I didn't talk about protections of constitutional rights, but maybe I'll come back to that in the questions if people are interested in. But basically our view is that the court really doesn't do a very good job. I mean, it's okay on speech, but not really on a lot of the constitutional rights, particularly the policing of abuses of the use of force by government officials. It's very hard to get a remedy for a violation of your constitutional rights in this country. How about speech and association? Well, as I said before, we don't follow the way the Europeans have gone, where you have kind of some body which will police who gets to speak and who doesn't in our democratic process. And we think that's good. We think this is the one dimension, this and maybe the difficulty of amending the Constitution, on which the United States performs pretty well when you compare it with that sort of set of pathways by which democracies erode. So, but 2 out of 5 is not a great performance. I mean, we give it a C- or a D+ or something. And in particular, in many other ways, legal doctrine, has sort of been developed to really facilitate the possibility to abuses of the population by government. All right. So what do we do about it? Well, I don't know if these people will be familiar to you, but that's a set of 5 people who all have something in common. That's Reverend Al Sharpton, John Paul Stevens, retired Supreme Court Justice, Senator Rand Paul. This is Larry Lessig, who was a former professor at the University of Chicago, who ran for president for about 5 minutes in the 2016 cycle on sort of a good government program. And that's, I think his name is Mark Levin, the Fox News. Yeah, Mark Levin. So he's a guy you might hear on the radio or see on TV. All of them have called for a new constitutional convention in the United States, and from very different perspectives. And this sort of, just to remind you, I mean, I didn't really know this until I started researching this book, but that we do have this second mechanism of amending the American Constitution. The one we all learn in our high school civics class is 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of the states. But there is this other mechanism where 2/3 of state legislatures can call for a new constitutional convention. And we're actually at the point, depending how you count, where 31 or so states have some kind of call out there. And you'd need 34. So this could happen in the next few years. I know the Koch brothers are really interested in this. Most of those states have issued a call for a convention to talk about one topic, balancing the budget, a balanced budget amendment. But there's one, I think it's Rhode Island, which is issued a call for overturning the Citizens United Supreme Court decision about corporate campaign financing. So you have all these different sort of calls, and they don't really overlap, and since we've never had one, no one knows what the rules are. But it could be the case that a Speaker of the House, and that would be the key character here. The Speaker of the House would be the one who would have to sort of define when we'd reach the number and what the rules of that convention would be. Now, I'm personally terrified of this because, in our history, of course, our last constitutional convention, they had a set of instructions and they just ran away with all kinds of other topics, right? And in the current state of American politics, I'm afraid we would be, talking about gay marriage and abortion and not the issues about, how to fix our government. But if we could, hypothetically, what should we do? Well, here we talk a little bit about the United States and also about kind of a generic country that is interested in sort of writing a constitution to prevent democratic erosion. What would you do? Well, the number one thing I think we should do, if we could, is to follow those 14 states and have some kind of independent electoral administration in every state. We know it works. It's obvious. The mechanism is obvious. It would require a constitutional amendment, probably, or state legislatures that would voluntarily enact this way of running elections, and that seems sort of, how to say it, incentive incompatible. Doesn't seem likely to happen. But even shy of that, there are ways we could improve our electoral institutions. It should be possible for secretaries of state, the National Association of Secretaries of State, to come up with common standards for running elections, to come up with, for example, ways of ensuring that there's not foreign interference with the vote counting, to come up with some kind of rule, just have a commitment of the secretaries of state, of the many states, to actually sort of run elections in somewhat compatible fashion. Not uniform. Maybe there's virtue in having lots of different systems so that it's sort of unpredictable and hard to capture the machinery at any one time. But we could do better even without a constitutional amendment is the point there. Many constitutions have special roles for the opposition, for the political opposition, where they are guaranteed in some, I was just reading about Burundi this morning, where Burundi had, because it has a long history of ethnic conflict, so what they did is they said, we're going to have a presidency and then we're going to have two vice presidencies, and each ethnic group of the two groups will have a vice president. And they're all part of the government structure. They ensured that the cabinet had people from both parties, from government and opposition. You can imagine legislative committees that would be chaired by opposition people. And I think that has two effects. One is just simply to legitimate the role of the opposition. Democracy requires an opposition. And we ought to just recognize that the opposition has a role to play in terms of improving governance, right? Improving the sort of epistemic basis of governance. We're not in that world now. We're in a world where the electoral cycle never stops, and so the goal is to demonize the opposition every minute of every day. And that's a real problem, I think, for the long-run health of our democratic institutions. This is something one could do in the United States without a constitutional amendment. Rules of Congress, the houses could actually institute things like this. I don't know if, again, it doesn't seem likely, given the state of our politics, but it could be done. The independent accountability machinery, things like counter-corruption commissions, rules about disclosing your wealth when you go into office. I suspect we're going to get those eventually, and that the president will, by law, have to disclose tax returns, I would hope, in the future. But I think that's going to be, at the end of this cycle, hopefully a set of reforms. But more structurally, to have institutions that are constitutionalized, that are sort of locked in there, that can't be manipulated as easily to ensure accountability. Our system of bureaucratic autonomy, one of the institutions which people like me study, which most people hadn't heard of until Trump got elected, is this thing called inspectors general. But basically every federal agency has someone called an inspector general who's a staff person, but functionally autonomous from everyone else, whose job is to audit and check everyone in the institution. And although that system has worked well in a number of the investigations which have come forward since the Trump presidency, it's not really that secure. There's nothing to prevent a president from appointing an inspector general who was a crony. And so I think better institutional protection for that system to reinforce the idea that the bureaucracy follows the rule of law would, I think, be a valuable thing. Since this is in the news today, I'm not sure this is really so much about erosion, but I do think our democracy would be much better if we were somehow able to end lifetime terms for Supreme Court justices. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, the incentive structure is to find the youngest possible person, which means we know the least about them, and then give them the seat for several decades, which is a major policy-making institution. You know, I don't think anyone really rationally designing a constitution would do it. No other country in the world has it. There are countries which have life terms, but they all have mandatory retirement ages of 75 and such, which are illegal generally in this country, but probably could be done for the Supreme Court by statute if Congress wanted to. I think some kind of limiting of the terms would do our country a great deal of good. We would therefore not be fighting elections about Supreme Court seats. The elections would be about elections, about policy, and about the democratic institutions, but not about this really powerful appointment power which which presidents covet in some sense. All right, so there's a lot of other things that we have in there. I do want to say that there's some things which come up which a lot of people say, well, we do have some good institution. And federalism is one I want to say a word about. Because federalism, of course, has been a major, again, in the news a lot in terms of helping to focus attention on how hard it is to change the entire government of the United States. We've got 51 different governments. No party is ever going to control them all. So the structures of federalism allow some kind of resistance, if you will, on some policies. The problem with that is that that's true, but federalism also allows, and by the way, I should say, the famous quote by Justice Brandeis, federalism is laboratories for democracy. You can try ideas out and then they can spread. I think in our era we have to worry about them being about laboratories for erosion. You have these innovations in, North Carolina, they go to Michigan, they go to Wisconsin, they go to Ohio, and there's no reason to think those things can't spread. It's also worth remembering that we had a subnational authoritarian regime until 1964 at best. At latest, I guess I should say, that's the earliest you could say the subnational authoritarian regime of the South actually was removed. So we actually had a dictatorship in this country, a non-democracy, in a vast swath of the country. Federalism is not automatically a panacea. Finally, there's a lot of talk now about how, the technologies of governance we use are really kind of old-fashioned, right? We don't do many other things, no one came here in a horse and buggy. I didn't write this book with a quill and pen, right? A quill and feather or something. Our way of thinking about democracy is rooted basically in 18th century technologies. And so there's a lot of efforts now to sort of invigorate participatory democracy on the internet, deliberative polls and things like this. All of these experiments I think are wonderful. But we don't have any examples where they could actually scale up to something like the size of the United States. They seem to work well at a very local level, but I don't think they're a magic answer. In the meantime, until those things are perfected, all we have is muddling through with our institutions and trying to improve them as much as we can. All right, well, I want to close with this Philip Roth quote, which is a book I reread again recently, and I guess that America's not exceptional. We are robust. It is very unlikely, based on what we know of experience of other countries, that democracy will end in America, because we've been a democracy for quite a while and we're a very rich country, and those are the two most important factors. At the same time, I think it's apparent, and it's apparent to most Americans, that we are at grave risk of democratic erosion, and how low that goes is an open question. So with that, I'll stop and be really interested in your questions and comments and concerns. Thanks. Yes, in the back.
So we're sitting here in the Lake County Forest Preserves. You might be interested to know that I think there are only about 4 forest preserves where we've decided to entertain free speech. I don't know whether this is one of them or not, but if you ever try to organize an event, you'll find out, because the Forest Preserve will enforce it. And so I was, you're talking about votes,
Yeah.
and but you're not talking about democracy. You have to be informed before you go and vote.
Yeah.
And so right now, what do we have? Well, we don't have the forest preserves. We got Facebook. Where do you actually? We can't have democracy in the mall.
Yeah.
Where do we have democracy?
Right.
Do you consider that a threat?
So I think it's something that our technological moment forces us to confront. Is the internet a democratic space? And it turns out often not. But I do think that there's more potential there than has been exercised to date. The fact is that we are, as a liberal democracy, sort of wide open to all kinds of interferences and such. But there is no reason that the internet companies, Facebook and such, could not really police fake news. They're really good at policing copyright, right? So there's no technical reason they couldn't do it. There's also no reason that we can't sort of encourage people, and this is, I think, the critical thing. Encourage places where people actually come together face to face across the big lines, across the sort of bubbles that we have developed on the internet, and to actually interact and talk things through. The caucus system, as it's used in Vermont and other places like that. I actually think, public events, so this thing I mentioned called deliberative polling is a really interesting experiment. What they do is they get people together and they ask them their view on some issue. And then they have them discuss with each other, why they think one thing or the other. And it turns out that when people do that, they become less polarized, they learn from each other. But how do we do that? The schools don't seem to be doing a great job of it. University, of course, we spend a lot of time talking about this and we care a lot about it. That's only a quarter of the people that go to university and such. So trying to institutionalize structures where citizens do that as a matter of course, I think would be wonderful. It's a really big project. And without it, I share your concern. I mean, votes is the 18th century technology. You come in once every 4 years or every 2 years, you cast your vote, and then you let the politicians go do stuff. That's really an old way of informing democratic governance. Of course, what it's turned into is one where every single action, every single newspaper is read in terms of is it a win or a loss for your team, and the campaign never stops. So I'm not sure that, polls every day on the internet would be a solution either. Yes?
I'm sorry, I've been mulling this over for the last year and a half. And I'm believing now that the Electoral College is an impediment to a democracy. And I was discussing this with a son the other night, and he said there are, maybe it's the same 14 states that you're talking, who have talked about or passed laws that require proportional delegations to the Electoral College after the state's tallies are done. They send their electors to the convention by proportion to the votes. Can that save us from the South carrying every damn election from now on?
Well, so the Electoral College is designed to overweight small states, right?
Yeah.
No matter what. So I don't think that is alone the solution if you want, to approach something like a majoritarian system. There is another effort, which I think is very valuable, which are states are kind of, there are a number of states which have passed rules where they vow that all their electors will go to whoever wins the national majority of votes. And that would stop us from the position which I fear we're going to be in for a couple more cycles, where it's quite plausible that a minority candidate of either party actually wins I guess it's just one party, but the minority candidate wins the presidency, which as someone who travels around the world, I hate it. I have to explain it every 4 years or every 10 years, I got to explain to someone why we have this crazy institution. But this idea that the states would pre-commit to support whoever wins the majority. And what they've done, they said, we promise to do that once enough states join this agreement to make sure that that person would win. So that could be that actually is a path which might get us to a majoritarian democracy without having a constitutional convention to get rid of the Electoral College. So there are several have done it. I think we're now at the point where it's something like 180 electoral votes are committed to this system. But you have to get to the point where 270 would be. So, that's quite plausible. This could happen in our lifetime. And that would be a major improvement on our current state of affairs. I don't know. Oh, it is? Yeah. So, so far it tends to be the big blue states which have done so. Yeah.
The League of Women Voters has a nationwide effort to amend the Constitution to abolish the Electoral College. Mm-hmm. And in Illinois, even though it seems like a big lift, we feel it's a more direct, honest way than the compact because the compact is confusing to a lot of people.
Right.
And the example I use, the compact requires, if it came into effect, it would come into an effect where the popular vote was different. So some state in that compact is going to have to reverse its vote.
Right.
So if it had been in effect, say, this last election, and let's say 10 years ago Wisconsin had signed on when Illinois did,
Yeah.
Governor Walker would have to tell the people of Wisconsin, well, I know you all voted for Trump, but see, we signed this deal 10 years ago, so we have to give our votes to Hillary.
Yeah.
And I think it would be very disruptive.
That's going to be a mess, I agree. But abolishing the Electoral College is also going to be tough, obviously, because there's a lot of states. I mean, the small states really, they know they're overrepresented and they enjoy that position. The one virtue of the Electoral College is you don't know in advance which state's going to be pivotal, and there's some virtue there. I suppose there's another, which is, and I think this was part of the original rationale in some sense, to the extent there was one, which is you can't really have regional parties in the United States. You can't have a party of the East Coast that just dominates the rest of us. You got to compete all over because of this weird math that's unpredictable. So that's one slight virtue. But to me, the cost of having minority candidates win is, I would join that effort, League of Women Voters. Yes, in the back.
Ginsburg. I had a questions about, like you mentioned, in ways to prevent erosion of democracy. There's one sentence is about institutions are only speed bumps.
Yes.
Can you further elaborate this sentence?
Yes.
Well, I mean, sometimes the way I say it is, only democracy can save democracy. All institutions can do is they channel sort of effort and opinion. But if you're talking about an institution which is a checking institution, an accountability institution, a court and such, those are not surefire, and over time they too get captured. And so the only thing in the end that matters is mobilization and getting people out to the polls. And so that's what I mean by that the institutions are only speed bumps. They can slow things down. Now, I said at the outset that we have something to learn from cases where democracy was about to collapse and then didn't. And one example might be Sri Lanka. Those who followed things overseas might remember a few years ago there's a fellow, Rajapaksa, who had became the president of Sri Lanka, appointed his brothers to all the crucial ministries, defeated the Tamil Tigers, and then was going to stay in office forever. He'd rigged the Constitution to allow himself an extra term. He was running in that election when someone in his party defected and ran against him and managed to win. And the critical thing there, Rajapaksa was trying to get the military to come out and trying to get to manipulate those people who were counting the ballots. But Sri Lanka's got kind of a rule of law tradition, and the bureaucrats who counted the votes really did count the votes, and the military refused to back him. So that's an example of how an institution kind of slows things down. And these are not, it's interesting, it's non-democratic institutions, or institutions which are not legitimated through the democratic process, militaries, bureaucracies, courts, commissions. Those turn out to be crucial for slowing things down when you're in a situation of erosion. But nothing is foolproof, and a powerful enough force can eventually control all those checking institutions. Yes?
Yes, is there a lot of, the reason there's a lot of erosion and checks and balances because there's no term limits on Congress. And as soon as they get into office, they're fundraising for their next election.
Yeah.
And because of that, they're not doing their job. It's going into that's why the Supreme Court is loaded, because they're not doing their own job and everything, and they're not reading their laws, and they're not doing, and so everything's going to one side of the, and also I was thinking, besides term limits, they have to, like a lot of countries, for elections, you get $250,000, and that's all you can spend.
Right.
And all these other people are getting loads, billions of dollars, and this is wrong. And I think we're getting the wrong people in office because it's who spends the most money.
Right.
So there's a lot of attention on that second point to the Citizens United decision. But one of the things about that is Citizens United could be repealed. We'd still have the problem of money in politics. It goes back to earlier Supreme Court cases where they equated money with speech. And of course, if you're going to equate money with speech, well then by definition we're not all equal, right? We're not, and so I think that fundamental equation is part of the problem, and I would obviously be in favor of more regulation of campaign finance and spending. But it seems to have a First Amendment problem in the way the court has interpreted the rules. In terms of the term limits, I'm actually, and this is not part of the book, but I'm in favor of term limits for the court and the presidency, but not for Congress. The reason is that I think Congress is really weak, actually. Much weaker than they should be in terms of playing their role in terms of oversight and actually passing legislation and such. And there's so many other aspects of the system with, the bureaucracy, the lobbyists, who are not term limited. And it takes, like anything else, expertise. It takes time to learn how to work your way through the system. And I don't see why legislating should be any different. It would be nice if we could get better candidates in there, more public interested people, but I think that's separate from the term limit problem. And indeed, you might say, well, if it's term limited, then you'd only get people who are rich who could afford to do it for a lark for a couple of years, as opposed to, the sort of fictive person who goes in and stays and masters the situation, if you will. Yes?
But then how do you answer the question about politicians who are relatively poor when they go into office and yet come out multi-jillionaires?
Well, again, I think, this is where just a simple asset disclosure rule would be very helpful. This is apocryphal what I'm about to say, so don't quote me on this, but a colleague told me that someone had done a study of the portfolios, the stock portfolios of members of Congress as compared to ordinary people, and it turns out their returns are supra-normal. They get better returns, because of course they have a lot of information about what's happening. So that's the kind of thing where disclosure, I think, would help, because then you could identify, and even identify their trades and such, that would sort of discourage that kind of profiteering. But
Of course, all of the money isn't made in the stock market.
yeah. No, that's right. Yes?
You mentioned a while ago about the military. What is the privatization of the military's impact on democracy? I think of Halliburton and Blackstar and those that are using taxpayer dollars to fund what was done, at least in my husband's cases, by military, people who volunteered and served their country. How does that impact?
It's a great question.
I think it's a really grave risk. If you look around the world, if you look at our own history, the expansion of the franchise, democracy and the volunteer military go together, I think. If the citizens are the ones who are doing the fighting, that's a constraint on the leaders getting into needless wars. It's a constraint on leaders manipulating us into wars that will allow them to consolidate power. So the volunteer army is a kind of constraint in a way, because people aren't going to be willing to die for a fake cause, if you will. So I think it's really significant. If you look at the franchise, the expansion of the franchise in the United States, it has always occurred after grave conflicts. World War I, women had to go into the workforce. After that, it sort of pushed the voting rights over the edge. After World War II, of course, African Americans came home and fought for the country, and they were treated as second-class citizens. It helped mobilize people. Also, perhaps a little bit of integration in the Army. The military has always been a much more integrated institution, so that was kind of a force for the expansion of the franchise and voting rights and such. And so, and then 18-year-olds in Vietnam, which was another extension. And so I think that, it is a risk that we are now at the point where there are more contractors than soldiers in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's a kind of tipping point. There's more contractors than soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that to me is a grave risk because, first of all, I don't know. I don't venture an opinion about what the optimal amount of time to stay in either of those theaters is. I don't want to really, second guess General Mattis or whatever. But the point is that if the decision is, if the people putting their lives at risk are paid contractors, well, then there's no real accountability for the decision in a way that there was in Vietnam eventually, right? Because of the body bags that came home. So I think it's a real essential thing, and not one many people are paying attention to. We talk a little bit about it in the book. Yeah.
One of the flaws that you mentioned earlier in the presentation was the flaws of democracy was the threat of tribalization. And I was wondering what you think the role of the internet plays. There are other factors that lead to tribalization too, but what do you think the role of the internet is? And how do you feel it threatens the two-party system?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of well understood now that the internet is polarizing, but that's only, I think it just exacerbates, polls that already existed. And, one thing is, we don't really teach people about, how to put it, sort of internet civics, if you will. That, just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. In fact, it's probably the opposite. But it's a sort of basic point, and I think it's always the case. Technology always jumps ahead of our educational system, our legal institutions, so we're always kind of playing catch-up. But this is an area where I think I'd like to see a lot more on sort of the civics of being an intelligent consumer of social media and such. I suppose there must be some efforts out there, but I think they should be, it'd be something that should be required in all schools. The fact is, the internet can only, obviously you can get all kinds of nonsense up there. But at the end of the day, it's people who are gullible, people who are not, well enough educated to sort the wheat from the chaff, and partly a political discourse which says facts are all relative anyway, and that have contributed to this mess. But I hope it's not hopeless. I don't think so. Yes?
You've done a fabulous job of articulating the pressures for erosion that we're facing. Are you willing to speculate one that really keeps you up at night?
That's a great one.
That's a great one. What do I worry? No, I mean, what are the things I worry about the most? To be honest, the one that has concerned me the most is this one that we were just talking about the epistemic erosion, if I can use that word. The idea that there are no facts, that it's all just your opinion, man. To quote The Big Lebowski, one of my favorite films. Sorry, that's really dangerous. I just don't see how you can, if that's actually the view of the majority of the people, then I don't see how we ever bring ourselves back from polarization. I just don't see it happening. The ultimate, the ideal of democracy is the small room where we kind of sit around and talk it out, and we, might have different views about the right policy and different preferences, and we can come to some kind of common decision through voting. We can live together there afterwards, even when we lose that. If there are no common facts to inform that policy debate, then why should we live with the guy who believes different facts? So I really think that's, in some sense, the core. Again, I think universities have a big role to play, but it's not just us. Obviously, responsible political discourse on this point. That's the thing which scares me the most. Yeah, you asked.
Yeah, could you just give us your opinion maybe about, as opposed to all the charts and graphs, there's a cyclical nature to democracy's rise and fall and coming to the brink and then coming back. When I saw the Philip Roth, I thought of the Sinclair Lewis book that was, 70 years ago, It Can't Happen Here, which is essentially the same book.
Right.
Is there a cyclical nature or not?
Yeah. What's interesting,
If you could somehow transport the founding fathers back now, they would be stunned that our democracy had survived this long, because they saw politics, they saw history as coming in cycles, and that there was an inevitable decline of republics, a corruption of republics. Washington famously thought the mechanism would be foreign interference and foreign entanglements and such. And so, but I'm not sure that I have a cyclical view of history. I do think that we periodically in our history have had moments of crisis where we're worried about our institutions. This certainly is one of them. But I don't see the fact that we've kind of come close and always come back, the fact that we've never suspended elections in this country. I'm not sure that I think that is, maybe it is periodic, but it's not. There's no rule that you get back or you're moving ahead. It could be that our future, that we look back, historians will look back, say the high point of American democracy was 1994 or something like that, or 1985. And in terms of the number of people who could vote, in terms of all those dimensions which Americans think are important. So that's why I sort of don't want to subscribe to a teleological view, I suppose. Yes?
This is the last question.
okay.
Is there such a thing as the deep state?
Yes, that's a funny term which has come up. The deep state. Does the deep state exist? Well, I mean, I haven't, it's very interesting how these terms morph from left to right in this case, and the language is used by both sides. Are there bureaucratic actors who resist and want to not follow what politicians say? Absolutely, naturally. I mean, that's the structure of bureaucracy. I don't like the term because it's a little conspiratorial. You know, it's of course comes from sort of you know, from oh, is that right? Interesting. Okay, comes from the Ottomans. The Ottoman bureaucracy, I guess, had this deep structure.
Right. Yeah.
So, so yes, of course it exists. It's in fact a concern. I should say also, just in this score, populism, which is a word which is now kind of an epithet, has a good side too, right? Populism is a movement for accountability when existing institutions aren't sort of matching the preferences of citizens. They're not delivering policy. That's when you get populism. But as in all things, you know, you do need institutions. You can't run a country, you can't run a modern government without them. And so they require investment, they require recognize, and they require periodic cleaning up and accountability. And so I'm very skeptical of an idea that a charismatic populist could run our country without a lot of deep state structure, if you will.
Thank you ever
Sure.
so much. Today was that Tom Ginsburg brought us the opportunity to do what he says is the cure for preserving our democracy, which is to talk about ideas which are difficult and think about them and then move forward to doing something. So our role as the Stevenson Center, but as all of you who come to our programs know, is for us to be agents in those conversations which will help keep our democracy alive. So thank you so much for having